He was a man of quiet routines. At 55, his life appeared stable to anyone looking from the outside. A respected businessman, a husband of 30 years, a father of 2 grown children who rarely called anymore. Every morning, he dressed neatly in pressed shirts and polished shoes, drove to his office, greeted his employees with a polite smile, and returned home in the evening to a house that felt colder than the winter wind outside. His marriage, once full of warmth and laughter, had long since withered into silence. His wife no longer met his eyes at the dinner table. They spoke only of mundane things, bills to pay, errands to run, and then retreated to separate corners of the house, like 2 strangers sharing the same roof. Nights were the hardest. Lying in his dark bedroom, he stared at the ceiling and wondered if this was all life had left for him. Quiet meals, empty conversations, and a heart that ached to feel alive again. It was during this hollow stretch of his life that she arrived, his cousin, visiting from another city after a rough divorce. She was in her late 30s, though to him, she still looked as radiant as she had when they were children playing in their grandmother's courtyard. She brought with her a certain lightness, an easy kindness that seemed to fill the rooms of his house. At first, it was nothing more than polite hospitality. He helped carry her luggage inside, showed her to the guest room, and welcomed her as any cousin might. But even in that first evening, he noticed the way she smiled at him across the dinner table, not out of duty, but with genuine warmth. Her laughter was soft but contagious, and she asked about his day as if she truly cared. Over the next few days, he found himself lingering in the living room after dinner just to hear her talk. She spoke of her struggles, but never with bitterness, and she always found a way to make him laugh, even when his heart felt heavy. She began making him tea before bed, a small gesture that he grew to look forward to more than anything else in his day. One evening, she touched his hand lightly as she passed him the cup. It was nothing, really, just a fleeting brush of skin, but it sent a quiet thrill through him, a spark he thought had long ago burned out. That night, he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking not of his wife or his empty marriage, but of her. The way her eyes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way her laugh filled the room. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him. It was wrong, of course. He knew it was wrong. But as he closed his eyes and imagined her smile, he also knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore this feeling much longer. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, but for him, everything had changed. Each morning, he caught himself glancing at the guest room door as he passed, hoping to catch even the faintest glimpse of her. At breakfast, he found himself watching her instead of eating. The way she stirred her tea, the gentle curve of her lips when she smiled at some passing thought. She seemed to sense his gaze, though she never said anything. Instead, she met his eyes with a softness that made his chest tighten. There was no denying it anymore. Something unspoken lingered between them, thickening with every moment they shared. He began inventing excuses to spend time with her. If she mentioned needing something from the market, he insisted on driving her himself. When she sat in the living room after dinner, scrolling through her phone, he made a habit of joining her with a book he never really read. Their conversations grew longer and deeper. She spoke to him about her divorce, about the loneliness that had followed her home each night like a shadow. He listened intently, offering what little comfort he could. In turn, she asked him questions no one else ever did, about his work, his childhood, his regrets. He found himself telling her things he'd never admitted aloud. One evening, while the house lay quiet and everyone else was asleep, he walked past her room and noticed the door slightly ajar. Warm light spilled into the hallway, and he paused, torn between propriety and longing. From within, her voice called softly. "Can't sleep either?" His breath caught. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. She sat on the edge of her bed in a loose sweater, a book resting on her lap. She smiled at him, not with surprise, but with something closer to expectation. He lowered himself onto the chair by her vanity, unsure what to say. But she spoke first. "Do you ever feel like no one really sees you anymore?" The question pierced him. He nodded slowly, unable to find the right words. She reached out, her fingers grazing his knee, just barely, and something in him shattered. The minutes passed like a fragile dream. They spoke in hushed tones, their words skimming over memories, heartache, and that strange ache of being alive yet invisible. She laughed once, softly, and it was all he could do not to reach for her right then. When he finally stood to leave, she looked up at him, her eyes holding his for just a moment too long. Neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to hum with a silent question neither dared ask, not yet. He left her room that night with his heart hammering in his chest, knowing he would be back. The storm came late one night, drenching the world outside in sheets of rain and shaking the windows with bursts of wind. He lay awake, staring into the darkness of his room, listening to the low rumble of thunder. Sleep was impossible. Her face kept surfacing in his mind, her voice, the warmth of her hand on his knee just nights before. At last, as if pulled by something stronger than his own will, he rose. Quietly, he stepped into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under his weight. Outside her door, he hesitated, his hand poised above the wood. For a fleeting moment, he thought of turning back, but the thought of another night alone in his cold bed was too much to bear. He knocked softly. The door opened just wide enough for her to peek through. Her hair was loose, her sweater draped carelessly around her shoulders, and her expression a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite name. "You're awake," she said in a whisper. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice hoarse. She opened the door wider, stepping aside to let him in. The room was warm and dim, lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. He stood awkwardly at first, unable to meet her eyes. She broke the silence. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," he murmured. And yet he didn't move. She sat back down on the bed, pulling her knees up under her sweater. He remained standing, staring at the floor, fighting the war raging inside him, desire against duty, longing against guilt. Finally, he spoke, his voice breaking. "I can't stop thinking about you. Every moment you're here, I feel like myself again." Her eyes glistened. She didn't answer at first, just looked down at her hands. Then, almost too quietly to hear, she whispered, "You're not the only one." His chest tightened at her words, and in 2 long strides he was beside her. He reached out and took her hand, afraid she might pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she looked up at him, her gaze searching his face, as if to make sure he truly meant it. He cupped her cheek, feeling her breath quicken under his touch. "Tell me to leave," he said, though his hand never left her face. But she didn't. And in the silence that followed, they leaned into each other, closing the space that had tormented them for nights. He kissed her lightly at first, tasting the salt of her tears, feeling the way she clung to his shirt as though she, too, had been waiting for this moment. The storm outside raged on, but within her room, the only sound was the quiet hum of 2 hearts betraying everything they were supposed to be. By the time he left her room hours later, the line they had crossed was behind them, and there was no going back. Morning came heavy with silence. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of tea, while the rest of the house bustled with the usual sounds, his wife humming faintly as she cleaned, his cousin moving quietly about her room. But he couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's eyes. The memory of the night before clung to him, like a second skin. He could still feel her warmth in his arms, hear her breathless whispers in the dark. Yet now, in the bright light of day, guilt settled over him like a storm cloud. Every smile his wife offered him felt sharper than a blade. Every glance from other relatives in the house made his skin prickle with unease. She avoided him that morning. Her door stayed closed. When she finally emerged, she barely looked at him. Her hair was tied up, her expression carefully composed. Still, he caught the faintest trace of sorrow in her eyes when she passed by, and it left him hollow. Later, she found him alone in the garden. He stood by the roses, hands in his pockets, watching the petals tremble in the breeze. She came to stand beside him, but kept her gaze fixed on the flowers. "This can't happen again," she said softly. Her words struck him harder than he expected. He turned to her, searching for something, reassurance, perhaps, or even defiance, but found only quiet resignation on her face. "They'll find out if we're not careful," she continued, her voice low and steady. "And we'll hurt everyone. I can't let that happen. You shouldn't either." He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her that he didn't care, that nothing else had made him feel so alive in years. But the weight of her words, and the truth in them, left him speechless. "You're leaving?" he finally asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, her lips trembling now despite her calm tone. "Tomorrow. It's better this way. For both of us." That night, she came to his room one last time. She stood in the doorway, her eyes shimmering in the dim light. Neither spoke at first. Then, slowly, she stepped inside and let him pull her close. They didn't speak of guilt or consequences. They simply held each other, memorizing the feel of the other before letting go. When morning came, she was gone. The house felt colder, emptier than ever. He stood outside her now, empty room, fingers grazing the doorframe as if it still held some trace of her. He thought of how betrayal sometimes came not from cruelty, but from a longing too strong to deny. And though he would carry the weight of what they'd done, he knew one thing for certain: he would never forget her.